My phone buzzed at 12:27 in the morning. I looked at the screen. Carol Hensley, my ex-wife's mother. I didn't think twice. I pulled on a jacket and got in the car. When I got there, the basement flooding, her standing in the kitchen with her hair pulled back in a hurry, her face pale. She looked at me and said something I wasn't expecting. "Don't tell her you came." At the time, I thought she just meant her daughter. Looking back on that moment now, I understand it meant something considerably larger than that. My name is Ryan Calloway. I'm 31 years old, and I work as a civil engineer here in Columbus, Ohio. Mostly bridge and roadway infrastructure for a consulting firm downtown. The kind of work that doesn't photograph well, but holds up entire cities without anyone thinking twice about it. It's not flashy. I like that about it. There's something satisfying about a job where the value of your work is measured in whether something stands up under weight, rather than in how it's perceived by people who'll never fully understand what went into it. I spend most of my days looking at load calculations and drainage plans, the kind of calm, quiet, methodical work that suits someone who's never been especially comfortable with big gestures or big speeches. I'm the kind of person who solves problems by doing something with my hands rather than talking them through out loud, which serves me well at a job site and served me considerably less well, as it turned out, in a marriage. I live alone now, in a 2-bedroom apartment in the short north, the kind of neighborhood full of restored brick buildings and coffee shops that didn't exist when I first moved to Columbus for college. I keep the second bedroom mostly empty, a treadmill I don't use often enough, and a few boxes I haven't unpacked since the divorce, less out of laziness and more because unpacking them would mean deciding what to do with things that used to belong to 2 people and now only belong to 1. Some evenings I run 6 or 7 miles along the Olentangy Trail just to have somewhere to put the extra hours a marriage used to fill without my having to think about it. I was married for 3 years to a woman named Melissa Hensley, and it ended 18 months ago without any single dramatic villain to point at. Nobody cheated. Nobody screamed. We just wanted different speeds of life, different volumes, and after 3 years of trying to close that gap, we both quietly admitted it wasn't closing. We met in our mid-20s, married reasonably fast, and I think, looking back, we mistook compatibility in the early excitement for compatibility in the long, ordinary stretches of daily life, which turned out to be a very different thing to test for. We tried counseling for about 4 months before either of us said the word divorce out loud, and by the time we finally said it, it landed less like a bomb going off and more like a fact we'd both already privately accepted weeks earlier. I don't carry anger about it anymore. Some evenings, in my apartment here in the short north, the quiet still catches me off guard. Not painfully, just noticeably, the way you notice a room is a different temperature than you expected. What I didn't expect, when Melissa and I got married 5 years ago, was that the most significant relationship to come out of that marriage wouldn't end up being with Melissa at all. It would end up being with her mother. I met Carol Hensley for the first time in the kitchen of the house on Birch Hill Drive in Westerville, the house Melissa grew up in, the one Carol still lives in alone. Carol was standing at the stove that day, stirring a pot of butternut squash soup, wearing her late husband's old apron because, she told me later, she'd never gotten around to buying her own. She shook my hand, looked me directly in the eye, the way some people never quite manage to, and said, "Whatever you ever need, you call me." I assumed, at the time, that it was one of those things people say at family gatherings without meaning it literally. I understand now she said it the way people only say things they genuinely intend to follow through on. Over the following 3 years of marriage, she became the person I actually called when I needed straightforward advice. Not because Melissa was ever unavailable, but because Carol had a particular gift for telling you the truth without requiring you to earn it first. Melissa used to tease me, gently, about how well her mother and I got along. "You two talk more than she and I do," she said once, not unkindly, more amused than anything. I laughed it off at the time, brushed it aside the way you brush aside most comments made in passing during a marriage that still feels, at that point, entirely secure. I've thought about that comment a fair amount since. How easily she'd noticed something neither of us had the language for yet, years before it became the reason her own marriage to me eventually needed re-examining, and long before it became anything either Carol or I would have called by its real name. The night that cemented something between us, though neither of us would have called it that at the time, happened 3 years before the midnight phone call. Melissa's father, Walter Hensley, had a stroke at 2 in the morning. By 4, Melissa had fallen asleep in one of those uncomfortable hospital chairs, exhausted past the point of staying conscious. I stayed up with Carol the rest of that night. We didn't talk much. I made her tea from the vending machine down the hall, twice, and sat next to her while the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the hospital did whatever hospitals do at 4 in the morning when nobody important is watching. At one point, she told me a little about how she and Walter met. A blind date neither of them wanted to go on, arranged by a coworker, back in a version of Columbus that barely resembles the city now. I listened. I didn't say much. When the doctor finally came out to tell us Walter hadn't made it, Carol didn't cry right away. She just looked at me and said, "I'm glad you're here." Not glad Melissa was here. Glad I was. I drove Carol home from the hospital myself that morning, while Melissa stayed behind to handle paperwork with her brother, who'd flown in from Denver the moment he heard. Carol didn't say much on that drive either. Somewhere near the halfway point, she reached over and rested her hand briefly on my forearm, just for a second, and said, "Thank you for not needing me to explain anything." I've thought about that sentence more times than I can count in the years since. It wasn't dramatic when she said it. It just settled into me quietly and stayed there, the way certain sentences do, waiting patiently for you to understand their full weight years later. After the divorce, that connection didn't sever the way you'd expect a connection to a former mother-in-law to sever. Melissa remarried within 6 months to a man named Greg Patton, a contractor with a loud voice and a habit of making decisions for other people without asking first. Carol didn't attend the wedding. She told everyone she was under the weather. I knew the real reason. She simply didn't approve of Greg. And unlike most people, she wasn't willing to pretend otherwise just to keep the peace. Carol kept calling me now and then, in the months after that. Not often, maybe once every few weeks. She'd ask how work was going, tell me about her tomato plants dying in the garden, complain about her furnace cutting out at odd hours. I always picked up. I never thought there was anything unusual about it. I just figured she was lonely, and I was familiar, and talking to me was easier than talking to anyone who might ask her uncomfortable questions about how she was really doing. There was a record player in the living room of that house on Birch Hill, an old wood-cased thing that had belonged to Walter, bought years before Melissa was even born. It had been broken since he died, and nobody had gotten around to fixing it. Carol had a habit of resting her hand on top of it whenever she walked past, the way you'd touch a doorframe out of pure muscle memory. I noticed that habit over the years of visits I made to that house. I never once asked her about it. I knew she kept calling me, I found myself thinking, more than once, in the months after the divorce. I knew I kept picking up. I never called it anything, just a thread I hadn't figured out how to cut, or maybe hadn't wanted to. To understand how I ended up standing in Carol's kitchen at nearly 1 in the morning, You have to go back through the 6 months that led up to it. A slow accumulation of ordinary moments that, individually, meant almost nothing, but that added up over time into something I only fully recognized much later. Carol started calling more regularly around the time Melissa married Greg. Not frequently, but with a rhythm to it, once every couple of weeks, always about something small. Work, the garden, a furnace that kept tripping its breaker for no obvious reason. I answered every time and gave her whatever ordinary advice or company she seemed to be after. I never thought there was anything particular happening underneath those calls. Looking back now, I understand she was quietly finding reasons to reach out, testing whether the connection between us would hold without Melissa there to justify it. I didn't see that at the time. I just picked up the phone. There was a particular call, maybe 4 months into that pattern, where Carol mentioned, almost offhandedly, that she'd started eating dinner standing up at the counter most nights instead of sitting at the table, because the table felt too large for one person. I remember that detail sticking with me longer than it probably should have. I didn't say anything about it directly, but that night I found myself standing in my own kitchen, looking at my own small table set for one, and understanding her comment in a way I hadn't expected to. I didn't say anything to her about that either. I just found myself thinking about it on and off for the rest of that week. The image of her standing there alone at that counter in a house built for a family of 4. 3 months before the flooded basement, Carol called about a strange sound coming from a pipe under her kitchen sink. I drove out on a Saturday afternoon and had it fixed within 45 minutes. A loose fitting, nothing serious. While I worked, she made dinner, and by the time I'd finished, the kitchen smelled like roasted chicken and rosemary, and there wasn't really a graceful way to leave without eating first. That was the first meal we'd shared, just the 2 of us, since the divorce. We sat at that table for close to 2.5 hours. We talked about Walter, about the house, about the roof that needed replacing eventually, about small things that didn't matter much on their own, a documentary she'd watched about the Great Lakes, a recipe she wanted to try but didn't want to cook for one person, a neighbor 2 doors down who kept letting his dog bark past midnight. At one point, she got up and pulled an old photo album off the shelf, unprompted, and walked me through pictures of Melissa as a kid. Awkward school photos, a birthday party gone slightly wrong when the cake collapsed, Walter teaching her to ride a bike in the driveway I'd parked in 100 times without ever knowing that story. I hadn't asked to see any of it. She just wanted to show someone, and I happened to be sitting there. We never once mentioned Melissa's current life, her marriage, any of it. It wasn't a deliberate avoidance. Neither of us felt the need to bring it up, which, in itself, should probably have told me something. I drove home that night and sat in my car outside my own building for a solid 15 minutes before going inside. I couldn't have told you why, if you'd asked me right then. I just sat there with the engine off, looking up at my own dark windows, feeling a strange reluctance to end the evenings that had nothing rational behind it. What I didn't know at the time, what I only understood much later, once I had enough distance to look back clearly, was that Carol had started that dinner nearly 2 hours before I ever arrived to fix the sink. She'd already known, somehow, that I'd end up staying. After dinner that night, while I was helping clear the table, I walked past the record player in the living room and stopped in front of it. "How long has this thing been broken?" I asked her. "Since he passed," Carol said. "I never knew who to call about it. Let me take a look." "You don't have to." I'd already sat down in front of it by the time she finished the sentence. The needle arm was misaligned, a small mechanical fix, the kind of thing that takes 10 minutes if you know where to look. I didn't say anything while I worked. I just fixed it. and then I turned it on. The first thing that played was an old jazz record, something Walter must have listened to often, judging by the worn grooves. Carol was standing in the doorway of the living room, a dish towel still in her hands. She didn't say anything. She didn't cry. She just stood there and listened, the way you listen to something you weren't sure you'd ever hear again. I remember watching her face in the lamplight, the particular stillness that had settled over her, and thinking that I'd just done something considerably larger than fix a broken machine, though I couldn't yet have explained exactly what. I didn't understand, standing there in that room, why the whole space suddenly felt different than it had a moment earlier. I just knew that it did. 6 weeks before the night I opened this story with, at 12:27 in the morning, my phone rang. Carol's name on the screen, her voice unusually level when I picked up. "The basement's flooding. The main line's burst." I put on a jacket and got in the car without really thinking it through, which is a detail I only noticed afterward, that I didn't hesitate for even a second, that there was no internal debate about whether this was reasonable or appropriate at that hour. I was simply already moving before the thought had fully formed. I got there in about 15 minutes, the streets nearly empty that time of night, streetlights blinking yellow at the intersections, the kind of drive that would have felt eerie under different circumstances, but that night just felt urgent, my hand steady on the wheel despite the hour, the radio off, my mind entirely on the road, and nothing else. Carol answered the door in her pajamas, hair pulled back hastily, feet in socks against the cold hardwood. We went down to the basement together, found where the pipe had split, and I used the small toolkit I kept in my trunk to shut off the main valve. It took roughly 40 minutes to get the situation under control, both of us soaked to the ankles, working mostly in silence except for the occasional instruction passed back and forth, the cold water numbing our feet through our socks and shoes by the time we finally got the valve to turn. Afterward, we sat at the kitchen table while she made tea. Neither of us said much for a few minutes. The adrenaline of the previous hour was still working its way out of both of us, and there's a particular kind of quiet that settles after a small crisis has passed. Not empty exactly, just full of things that don't need saying yet. "Thank you for coming," Carol said eventually. "Of course," I told her. "Don't tell her you came." "Carol," I started. "Melissa wouldn't—" "It's not that I'm embarrassed," she said. "I don't want her thinking you came because of her. You came because I asked." I looked at her for a moment. The sentence carried more weight than its surface suggested, but I didn't slow down long enough, right then, to understand exactly why. I nodded, drank the rest of my tea, and let the moment pass the way I'd let so many moments pass over the previous months, without examining it too closely. On my way out, I passed through the living room. The record player was still running. She must have turned it back on before she ever called me. Something slow was playing, a song I didn't recognize by name. I looked at the machine, then at her, and didn't say anything. "He used to put music on when he needed to think," Carol said. I drove home with that song still faintly running through my head. What I didn't understand yet, what I only pieced together much later, was that Carol hadn't turned the record player on to think. She'd turned it on because I was coming. 3 weeks after that night, I noticed I'd started finding reasons to drive out to Westerville more often than any actual repair required. Checking on the pipe again, bringing tools, just in case. One time, I showed up with no reason at all, just told her I was in the area, which wasn't remotely true, given how far Westerville sat from anywhere I had actual business being. Carol opened the door that day like she'd already known I was coming. I didn't call any of it anything yet. I just kept showing up. There was an evening during that stretch where I stayed until nearly 10. The two of us working through a crossword puzzle at her kitchen table, arguing lightly over a 5-letter word for a type of bird. Both of us convinced we were right until she pulled out her phone to settle it, and I turned out to be wrong, which she never let me forget for the rest of that evening. I remember checking the clock and feeling a small jolt of surprise at how late it had gotten, followed almost immediately by a reluctance to actually leave. I didn't examine that reluctance very closely at the time. I just said goodnight, drove home, and told myself it had simply been a pleasant evening. Nothing more complicated than that. Then Melissa found out. She called me on a Tuesday evening, her voice cold in a way I hadn't heard directed at me since before the divorce papers were signed. "Mom says you've been coming out there." "The pipe burst," I said. I went to help. "That was 3 weeks ago, Ryan. You're still going out there." I didn't deny it. Melissa's voice climbed higher. "Do you have any idea how that looks? Do you have any idea what people are going to think?" "What people?" I asked. She hung up without answering. I sat with the phone in my hand for a while after that call ended, replaying the conversation, trying to figure out exactly what I was supposed to feel guilty about. I hadn't done anything I could clearly point to as wrong, and yet something in her tone had lodged itself under my skin regardless. The particular sting of being accused of something you can't quite defend against because you don't fully understand the accusation yourself. I made dinner that night and barely tasted it, my mind still stuck on the coldness in Melissa's voice, a coldness that felt different from the ordinary friction of ex-spouses navigating a shared history. 2 days later, Greg Patton called me directly. Not through Melissa. Straight to my phone, in the tone of a man used to making decisions for other people. The kind of voice that assumes it's owed a hearing simply because it's decided to speak. "I think we should talk like adults," he said. "You're going out to your ex-mother-in-law's house regularly. Does that strike you as a problem?" "I go to help her fix things," I said. "You've been out there 3 times in 4 weeks, Ryan. I'm not naive. And Melissa isn't naive either." Then his voice dropped lower, taking on a false, careful friendliness, the kind salesmen use right before the pitch turns into the close. "Look, I get it. Carol's an easy woman to like. You feel some sense of obligation toward her. But let's be practical about this for a second. You're her daughter's ex-husband. She's lonely. You're lonely. You think you're helping, but you might just be letting her attach herself to something that has no future." Then came the sentence that stayed with me longest. "I don't have a problem with you personally, but Carol is my wife's mother. And you being out there, it complicates things for everyone, including her, including you." I didn't respond. Greg kept going. "What do you think Carol actually wants out of this? A man to fix her pipes? Or is she lonely enough to accept whatever attention she can get from anyone willing to stick around?" I hung up without saying much of anything. My hand was actually shaking slightly when I set the phone down on the counter, which surprised me, because I don't usually let people get under my skin the way Greg had just managed to. I stood in my kitchen for a long time after that call, not moving, not doing anything productive, just standing there with his words looping through my head. I didn't call Carol that week. She didn't call me either. I sat in my apartment, staring at the phone, turning Greg's question over more times than I wanted to admit. Not because he was right, but because it was the exact question I'd been quietly avoiding asking myself, phrased in someone else's words, for months. I went to work each day, did my job competently enough that nobody around me seemed to notice anything was off, and came home each evening to an apartment that felt considerably quieter than it had a month earlier. Greg Patton wasn't wrong about one fact. I had been going out there, more often than made practical sense. That part was true. But the question underneath his question, what did Carol actually want from any of this, was one I'd been dodging for a long time, and the reason I'd been dodging it, I finally had to admit to myself somewhere around the 12th quiet Tuesday in a row, wasn't because I didn't know the answer. It was because I was starting to suspect the answer applied just as much to me as it did to her, and I wasn't sure yet what I was supposed to do with that. 10 days after Greg's phone call on a Saturday afternoon, I drove out to Westerville without calling first. I rang the bell. Carol opened the door in her gardening clothes, dirt still under her fingernails, and looked at me without a word for a second longer than usual. "Ryan," she said. "I want to talk," I said. She opened the door wider. We sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where we'd shared that first dinner months earlier, the same table where she'd told me not to mention the flooded basement. I started with the truest thing I had picked. "I realized I'm not coming out here for the pipes," I said. "I'm not coming out here because I'm lonely and need something to do with my hands. I'm coming out here because I want to be here, and I don't know what to do with that." Carol didn't interrupt. She sat very still, her hands folded on the table in front of her, listening the way she always listened, fully, without rushing me toward some conclusion she'd already decided on. Greg called me. Melissa called me. And the question they were both asking underneath everything else wasn't a wrong question. What does Carol actually want out of this? And I realized I'd never once asked you that directly. I just kept showing up. She looked down at her hands for a moment. Then she said, "The first time I called you, the pipe under the sink, last month, it wasn't really that urgent. I could have waited until morning and called a plumber. I knew you'd come if I called, and I wanted to find out if that was still true." I didn't say anything. The basement flooding, that was real, but I called you before I called anyone else. I realized that while I was dialing. She paused, glancing toward the living room, toward the record player I could just make out from where I sat. "I told myself I was calling you because you were closest, because you're good with your hands, because it was practical. But somewhere in the middle of typing your name into the phone, I knew none of those were the actual reason." She was quiet for a moment longer before she went on. "I didn't plan any of this. I just know that since Walter died, you're the only person who's ever come into this house and let me not perform being fine. Melissa loves me the way a daughter loves her mother, which means she needs me to be okay. She calls, and I tell her I'm fine, and she believes me, because believing me is easier for both of us. You never needed that from me. You just needed me to be real." She paused again, looking past me toward the living room, toward the record player just visible through the doorway. There were nights, the first year after he died, when I'd sit right there in that chair and just listen to nothing, because I didn't have the energy to fix the machine, and I didn't have anyone I trusted enough to ask. Melissa would call, and I'd tell her I was fine, watching television, whatever seemed easiest. Then you'd call instead, some evenings, just to check in, and I never once had to perform anything for you. I didn't understand for a long time why that mattered as much as it did. I think I understand it now. I sat with that for a moment before I answered. "I don't want to complicate your life," I said. "I don't have some plan, some set of expectations. But I also can't sit in that apartment for 10 more days pretending I don't know why I want to come back here. I've been telling myself for months that I keep showing up because I'm being a good former son-in-law, checking in on a widow who's alone in a big house. That's not nothing. But it's not the whole truth either. and I think you already know that." I could hear my own voice shake slightly on that last part, which surprised me, because I don't usually let myself sound uncertain out loud. Carol looked up at me, and for a moment neither of us said anything. The kitchen clock ticked somewhere behind her. Outside, a lawnmower started somewhere down the street. That same ordinary sound that always seemed to show up right when the conversation mattered most. "I don't know what this is supposed to look like," she said finally. "I've spent 3 years being somebody's widow and 6 months being somebody's disapproving mother-in-law. I don't have a category for whatever this is." "Neither do I said. "But I'd rather figure it out slowly than not figure it out at all." I meant it. I'd spent enough of the last year and a half rushing toward conclusions that turned out wrong, and something about sitting across from her in that kitchen made rushing feel like the last thing either of us needed. Neither of us said anything for a while after that. I stood up, walked into the living room, and turned on the record player without asking. The familiar song came up. Carol sat at the kitchen table, listening from a distance, her eyes closed for a moment before she opened them again. "He used to say," she said quietly, "that anything real has weight to it. Can you carry weight?" "I've never tried," I told her, "but I'm not planning on walking out before I find out." The week after that conversation, nothing moved fast, and that felt intentional rather than hesitant. There was no formal first date. I started calling in the evenings instead of just showing up unannounced. Carol started telling me about her day in a way I don't think she told anyone else. Small things, the kind that don't matter to most people, but mattered to her. Her tomato plants finally dying off for the season. A new family moving in 2 houses down. A call from Melissa. She didn't know how to answer honestly. I remember one particular evening during that quiet, careful stretch after our kitchen table conversation, sitting on Carol's back porch as the sun went down, both of us wrapped in blankets against the early autumn chill, not saying much of anything, just watching the yard go from gold to gray to dark. She mentioned, almost in passing, that this was the first fall in 3 years she hadn't dreaded. I didn't ask her to elaborate. I understood exactly what she meant without needing the explanation, and I think that mutual understanding, more than any single conversation, was what convinced me this was worth being patient for. There was a particular Wednesday call, about 10 days into this new rhythm, where Carol told me about a dream she'd had about Walter. The first one in months, and how strange it felt to wake up from it and reach for the phone to tell someone, only to realize the someone she wanted to tell was me. She said it plainly, without making it into anything bigger than it was. But I sat with that phone against my ear for a long moment after she said it, feeling the particular weight of being trusted with something that fragile. Melissa did call, and it wasn't gentle. Carol let her say everything she needed to say, and then answered calmly. "I love you, and you know that. But my life didn't end when your marriage did. Ryan is a good man. That doesn't change just because the 2 of you aren't together anymore." Melissa didn't speak to her mother for 3 full weeks after that conversation. Carol told me about it plainly, without asking me to fix it or feel guilty over it, though I could tell, underneath her steady voice, that the silence from her daughter cost her something real. I offered once to call Melissa myself and try to smooth things over. Carol shook her head at that idea before I'd even finished the sentence. "This isn't yours to fix," she told me. "She needs to come to it on her own time, or not at all. Either way, that's between us, not you." I respected that, even though it meant sitting with a certain amount of guilt of my own, knowing I was at least partly the reason for the distance between a mother and her only daughter. It's a strange thing, being the cause of a rift you never intended to create, and I carried that feeling around with me for weeks, even as everything else between Carol and me continued to steady itself. Greg tried one more time, calling Carol directly this time. She didn't dodge it the polite way she might have a year earlier. "Greg," she said, "you're my daughter's husband, and I respect that. But you don't get a say in who I invite into my own home." He hung up. Carol made tea afterward and went back out to finish watering what was left of her garden, entirely unbothered, at least outwardly. I asked her later if the call had upset her. She thought about it for a second and said, "Less than it would have a year ago. I think I'm finally getting the hang of not needing everyone's approval before I let myself have something good." 2 months after that kitchen table conversation, I brought over a vinyl record I'd spent 2 weeks hunting down online. The exact song Melissa and I had danced to at our wedding years earlier. Neither of us had mentioned that song once since the divorce. I didn't explain anything. I just set it down on the table. Carol looked at the record, then at me. "Where did you even find this?" "eBay," I said. "Took 2 weeks. The seller was in Cleveland, of all places, and I nearly gave up twice before it finally showed up in decent condition." She stood, walked over, and placed it on the turntable. We heard that song together for the first time in years. Neither of us danced. We just sat there and listened, the needle catching softly on the old vinyl, the melody filling that living room the same way it must have filled a wedding hall years earlier for an entirely different reason. "I don't know what to call this feeling," I told her afterward, "but I know it's real." She reached over and squeezed my hand once, briefly, without saying anything more. Some sentences don't need an answer. That was one of them. The record kept spinning behind her, the needle catching that same familiar groove it had caught at our wedding years earlier, in a completely different room, in a completely different chapter of both our lives. And yet somehow, it felt exactly like it belonged right there in that living room too. It's autumn in Columbus now, nearly a year since that midnight phone call. Maple leaves scatter outside my apartment window most mornings before I've even had coffee. Carol comes into the city now and then. Nobody gave that habit a name until about 4 months ago, when I finally asked her outright what she wanted to call it, and she answered without needing a second to think it over. Melissa has come around, slowly, not thrilled about any of it, but no longer at war with it either. She and Carol talk less often than they used to, though not never. Carol has never once pushed her daughter to feel a particular way about any of this, on any particular timeline. I've learned, watching her handle that relationship, a fair amount about patience I didn't previously have much practice with, the kind of patience that doesn't demand resolution on any particular schedule, that's willing to let a wound close at its own speed rather than forcing a scab off too early just to feel finished with it. I don't call Carol my ex-mother-in-law anymore, though I haven't landed on a better word for what she actually is to me now. Maybe that word isn't necessary yet. Maybe it won't ever be, and that's fine too. One Saturday afternoon not long ago, back at the house on Birch Hill, the record player was running. The same jazz Walter used to listen to. I sat in his old chair in the living room, the first time Carol had ever invited me to sit there. We drank coffee in the same room he used to sit in every evening of his life, the afternoon light coming in low and gold through the curtains he'd probably picked out himself decades earlier. I rested my hand on top of the record player while it played, the exact gesture I'd watched Carol make so many times over the years without ever asking about it. She noticed and smiled, just slightly. "He would have liked you," she said. "I know," I told her. "You've told me." I nearly said Tyler had told me, a name that belongs to nobody in this story, a slip that came from somewhere I couldn't quite place. Maybe some other conversation entirely, tangled up in my memory. It wasn't Tyler. It had always been Carol, telling me small pieces of Walter over years of visits, long before either of us understood what we were actually building between us. I knew that. She knew that. Neither of us bothered correcting it. We just sat there a while longer, the record still turning, the afternoon light shifting slowly across the floorboards until it was nearly gone. The question Greg Patton asked me that day on the phone, what does Carol actually want out of this, turned out to be the right question, just answered in a way he never expected. She wanted to be herself with someone who didn't need her to perform anything. And it turns out, so did I. I've thought a lot this past year about the difference between the kind of love that gets announced and the kind that just quietly accumulates until one day you look up and realize it's already been there for months. Nobody in my life would have predicted this particular shape of things. I certainly wouldn't have predicted it myself, back in that kitchen 5 years ago, shaking hands with a woman stirring butternut squash soup in her husband's old apron. But I've come to believe that the relationships worth having rarely announce themselves in advance. They just keep showing up, again and again, in small, unremarkable ways, until eventually you notice you've built something without ever quite deciding to. My grandmother used to say that love that lasts is rarely the kind that arrives with fireworks. It's usually the kind that shows up quietly on a Tuesday and simply never leaves again. I didn't understand that sentence for most of my adult life. I think I finally do now. I used to think my connection to Carol was some kind of leftover from a marriage that had already ended, something that should have been cleared away along with everything else once the papers were signed. But there are threads between people that don't run through a marriage license at all. They run through nights spent sitting beside someone in a hospital waiting room at 4 a.m, through dinners where the person who first connected you never once comes up, through an old record player, quietly repaired, in a room gone silent for 3 years. I don't know exactly what the future looks like, neither does Carol, but the record player is still running in that living room on Birch Hill Drive. And for the first time in a long while, I'm the one holding the door open, instead of the one who ends up walking out of it last. There's a particular kind of peace in that, one I didn't expect to find at 31, divorced, sitting in the same chair a dead man used to sit in, drinking coffee with the woman he loved for over 30 years. I don't take it lightly. I don't think either of us does. Grief and love aren't opposites, I've learned. They can sit in the same room together, on the same worn armchair, listening to the same worn record, without one needing to cancel the other out. So let me ask you something. Have you ever had a relationship with someone, not romantic, not in any ordinary sense, at least not at first, connected to you only through a third person, and only understood what it actually meant once that connection disappeared? And if someone told you, "Don't tell her you came," would you have had the courage to ask yourself why that sentence didn't make you want to turn around and leave? If this story brought someone to mind, a connection you've kept alive outside the rules most people expect, leave a comment and tell me about it. Like this video if you believe some of the realest relationships start in circumstances nobody else quite understands. And subscribe, because next week I've got another story about ordinary people, midnight phone calls, and the sentences nobody sees coming that end up changing everything.